All right, we're talking market basket. So, how do we calculate this basket? We go out and we price everything, right? We've been talking about that. So we figure out what the average person shops for, and we go out all over the country and figure out what the average price of that is. So we know what the average price of a jar of Skippy is. We multiply that times how many jars of Skippy we're going to buy, and it turns out, let's say this basket in our base year costs us $3,000 a month to buy. So the average person, the average household spends $3,000 a month buying the basket. Then we go out every month and do it again. And maybe 10 years later, we do it again, and the basket costs $4,500. Well, what's the CPI? Well, the CPI is the basket today divided by the original basket. So the first CPI is going to be 3,000 divided by 3,000, which is 1, times 100 is 100. And so the base year is equal to 100. The CPI, if the basket costs 4,500, we take 4,500, we divide it by 3,000, multiply times 100, that's 150. So we say, oh, in the last 10 years, prices have gone up 50%. Easy? Cool? Exciting? Yes, it is. It's hard to get more exciting than this. This is why you paid for this course, so you could get this knowledge. All right, so again, we're creating what's called an index number. In the base year, it's equal to 100. If it doubles, it's equal to 200. And it's all based on valuing the market basket, which means the trick is we got to have the right market basket. And I guarantee you that almost all of us, certainly me, the market basket they have ain't my market basket. But let's go find out here. So, some things matter. Not all prices rise or rise at the same rate, and in fact, some fall. I have a laptop at home that I keep on my shelf for class demonstration purposes. It's a beautiful laptop. I paid $500 for it. Yeah, it has 640K of RAM. Not M, not G, 640K. K. That's K. K. 640K. It has a 4.77 megahertz processor, which means the processor, my computer that I'm doing this on, has multiple cores and processor speed 1,000 times faster. It's got more than 1,000 times more memory. It's got so a modern computer is thousands of times better than my laptop, and yet it costs about the same. So the decrease in prices in computers, the government says, computer prices have gone down 90% in the last 40 years. Well, no, they've gone down a whole lot more than that. But the way the system is set up, you can't calculate it. Okay? And as we're going to see, and as we know, things like medical care and college tuition have gone up way faster than other things, and some things haven't gone up hardly at all. So, a couple of things to remember. There is a quality bias in here. Car tires are not that much more expensive than they used to be, but they're way better. Car tires used to go flat all the time. People had real size spares in their car, and girls and boys were all taught by their daddies to change a tire because every few years you were stopped at the side of the road changing a tire because your tires were garbage. Now tires are really good. They last a lot longer, and they're far less likely to go flat, and yet the prices are about the same, so we don't see that. Substitution. What year is the base year for the CPI? Oh, yeah, that's 82 to 84, so just say 83 for convenience. How did people get their music in 83? Well, they bought vinyl. They bought tape, cassette tapes, and CDs were just coming out. But they were buying physical media or they were listening to the radio. And that's how you got your music. Now, most people get their music streaming or, at worst, downloading. Hardly anybody's out there buying CDs. Nobody's out there buying tape. And Only people who are real audiophile people are buying vinyl. So how do we adjust this thing for the fact that we're not buying the same stuff? Yeah, prices. This is what happened to prices. Well, except we're not buying the same stuff. So they change what's in the basket and they say, oh, we adjust. But really, you can't adjust for the massive changes in the, right? Just can't. And then, of course, there's new stuff that comes out that weren't in the basket originally, and they're going to show that stuff is going to show up in the basket because we're buying it. But, how do we really account for that? And it's just not clear that we can. Okay? And even on top of that, the CPI is only intended for urban wage earners. That means people who live in a city and are kind of middle-class people who live in a city. Well, so doesn't apply to me. I'm a college professor. It doesn't apply to me. It doesn't apply to people who live in rural areas. If you live in Mesquite, it doesn't apply to you, or Alamo. If you're, working on Wall Street, it's not going to apply to you. There's all kinds of people that, by definition, it doesn't even apply to. And yet we use it to make adjustments. So like Social Security benefits are adjusted by the Consumer Price Index when we know that the basket doesn't really work for senior citizens. We have other indices that we use. The first one is the Producer Price Index. That's a market basket of things that businesses buy. So businesses buy steel. Most of us don't buy steel, so steel is in the PPI bucket. Paper clips are stuff that, if we buy them for our house, but businesses might buy a lot of paper clips, right? Stuff that businesses buy. Restaurants buy raw food in certain ways. They buy stuff, right? So what do businesses buy? Then the second index we use is called the GDP deflator. The GDP deflator is what turns GDP into real GDP. Really, though, we calculate that backwards. We calculate GDP, we calculate real GDP, and then we do algebra to figure out what the deflator is. So it's kind of cheating. So overall today, the Consumer Price Index is 317. That means that prices are a little over 3 times higher than they were in 1983. That's really good for a long period of time in American history. That's really low inflation. A year ago, it was 308. So what was inflation last year? It was 317 divided by 308 minus 1 is 2.9%. Okay? So inflation last year was pretty good, not great. The Federal Reserve wants it to be below 2, and it's 2.9. But it's a lot better than it was not that long ago. Okay? So different prices go up at different speeds. So right now, the overall CPI is 317, but food that you go to the grocery store and buy so you can eat it at home is 335, which is a little bit higher. Gasoline is 275, which is a little bit lower. Clothes are 128. Why have the price of clothes hardly gone up in the last 40 years? It's because our clothes 40 years ago, clothes are made in the United States, and now they're not. The fact that we import most of our clothes from low-wage countries has kept the price of clothing down. Imagine that we still made clothes in the United States. What would we be paying for them? Well, the answer is the average price of every piece of clothing that you buy would probably be double of what it is. Okay? Now we can talk about whether we're exploiting workers because, they're getting paid, they're working in sweatshops, and sometimes it's little kids and they're getting paid $2 an hour, and all of that's terrible. But at the same time, what happens to us if we stop importing clothes? Aside from the fact we don't have any factories or trained workers here in the United States, the price of everything would go up substantially. New cars are 178. Why? Well, again, where do the car parts come from? We make the cars in factories in the United States, but the parts come from Mexico, come from China, come from Vietnam, right? And so the parts are now cheap, and we get them into the United States. We build cars out of them, and that's helped keep the price of cars down. On the other hand, there's stuff that we do just in the United States. And again, food at home. Right now, the price of avocados is soaring because we're going to put tariffs on them, and we're going to because they come from Mexico, right? Rents gone up 4 times since 1930. Medical care is 600. Medical care has gone up twice as fast. The cost of getting it to the doctor has gone up twice as fast in the last 40 years as the average thing that we buy. And insurance has gone up almost 9 times. Okay? A lot of that insurance price increase, by the way, is tied to global warming if you do your math and see what's going on in California and see what's going on in places like Florida. So, what history do we know? So this is the inflation rate, again, going back to about 1950, and you can see that it's been higher or lower. You can see that it hit, 8-ish% briefly a couple years ago, and that's high, but not nearly as high as what we had in the 80s when we were up, 70s and 80s where we were up 12%, 13%, 14%. So, right, it's where it was a couple times in the 50s. It's not historically high. And if you go back to the era right after, around World War I, inflation was off at 17, 18, 19%. So this is pretty good inflation for us. It's still not good, but relatively speaking, it's not the worst thing ever that some people try to tell you it's the worst inflation ever. Not even close to the worst inflation ever. And we'll talk about where it came from here in a minute. You can see, though, that there was hardly any inflation for a really long period of time. From the mid-'80s all the way until the pandemic, we'd pretty much calmed inflation down, so it was 2-3% most of the time. We call that the Great Moderation. That had never happened before. People have short memories, and of course some of you are youngins. The period that we just went through, those 40 years where inflation was low the whole time, that's never happened before in American history. So we lived through this bizarre 40 years with hardly any inflation, and people came to think that was normal, when if we look back in time, we know that that's not normal. But, people's expectations, and we'll talk about that more. Okay? So, in 1912, and I picked 1912 for a reason, the CPI is 9.9. Now, it is ridiculous to compare 1912 to now, because in 1912, radio was a new thing. New thing. Cars were new things. To try to compare what it cost to do something in 1912 versus what it costs today is just ludicrous. But let's skip that. CPI today is $3.17. What's $1 in 1912 worth today? Well, the answer is, to find the value, we take the year we're going to and divide it by the year we're coming from. So we're going to 317. We came from 9.9. We're going to take $1. We're going to multiply times 317, divide by 9.9, and you get $32.02. So on average, according to the CPI, what costs $32 today would it cost $1 in 1912. Okay, a $2,000 salary in 1912 buys about the same stuff that a $64,000 salary buys today. Okay, so if you were living in 1912, a really good middle-class salary would have been $2,000 a year.